Lying upon a sofa, Harker Braden was reading marvels of science. Reflecting on what he had read, he unconsciously lowered his book without changing the direction of his gaze. Suddenly something in a dark corner of the room drew his attention. What he saw, in the shadow under his bed, was two small points of light about an inch apart. They may have been reflections of the gas lamp above him, in metal nail heads. He gave them little thought and resumed his reading. A moment later some impulse made him lower his book again and seek for what he saw before. The points of light were still there. They seemed to have become brighter than before, shining with a greenish luster that he had not at first observed. He thought that they had moved a little, were somewhat nearer. However, he couldn't reveal their nature and origin, and again he resumed his reading. Suddenly something in the text suggested a thought that made him start and drop the book for the third time to the side of the sofa. Brayton, half rising, was staring intently under the bed where the points of light shone, as it seemed to him, much brighter. His attention was now fully waked, his gaze eager and intensive. It revealed almost directly under the foot of the bed the coils of a large serpent. The points of light were its eyes. Its horrible head was directed straight toward him. The eyes were no longer luminous points, they looked into his own with an evil expression. A snake in a bedroom of a modern city flat is, happily, not so common a phenomenon as makes explanation needless. Harker Braden, a bachelor of 35, a scientist, rich, popular and healthy, had returned to San Francisco from remote and unknown countries. He accepted the invitation of his friend, Dr. Druring, the famous scientist, and was staying at his large old-fashioned house. Dr. Druring's interest was reptilian. He kept them in a distant wing of the house that he used as a combination of laboratory and museum, and that he called the snakery. Despite the snakery, Braden found life at the Drurings' house to be very pleasant. Except for a slight shock of surprise and a shudder of mere disgust, Mr. Braden was not greatly affected. His first thought was to ring the bell and call a servant, but then it occurred to him that the servant would suspect him of fear, which he certainly did not feel. The reptile was of a species with which Braden was unfamiliar. Its length he could only guess. The body at the largest visible part seemed about as thick as his arm. In what way was it dangerous, if any? Was it venomous? Was it a constrictor? His knowledge of serpents did not enable him to say. Braden rose to his feet and prepared to back softly away from the snake, without disturbing it if possible, and leave through the door. He knew he could walk backwards without mistake. In the meantime, the snake's eyes burnt with a more pitiless malevolence than before. Braden lifted his right foot to step backwards. His hand upon the chair was grasping it. Nonsense! he said aloud. I am not so great a coward as to be afraid. He lifted his foot a little higher and put it sharply to the floor, 1 inch in front of the other. He heard somewhere the continuous throbbing of a big drum with sounds of far music, sweet and beautiful, like the tones of an Aeolian harp. The music stopped, or rather it became the distant troll of a retreating thunderstorm. A landscape, shining with sun and rain, lay before him, and in the middle of it a huge serpent, wearing a crown, was putting its head out of its large coils and looking at him with the eyes of his dead mother. Suddenly this enchanting landscape seemed to rise upward, like the drops seen at a theater, and vanished. Something struck him upon the face. He had fallen to the floor, blood ran from his broken nose and lips. In a few moments he had recovered, and then realized that this fall, by interrupting his gaze, had broken the spell that held him. He felt that now if he did not look at the snake, he would be able to retreat. But the thought of the serpent within a few feet of his head, yet unseen, perhaps in the very act of springing upon him and throwing its coils about his throat, was too horrible. He lifted his head, stared again into those sinister eyes, and was again in their slavery. The snake had not moved and seemed to have lost its power over his imagination. The wonderful illusions of a few moments before were not repeated. Its black, beady eyes simply glittered with an expression unspeakably malignant. Then came a terrible scene. The man, lying upon the floor, within a yard of his enemy, raised the upper part of his body upon his elbows, his head thrown back, his legs extended to their full length. His face was white and his eyes were wide open and were staring at the snake. Strong convulsions ran through his body, making almost serpentine movements. And every movement left him a little nearer to the snake. Dr. Druring and his wife sat in the library. The scientist was in a very good mood. I have just obtained by exchange with another collector, he said, a wonderful specimen of the Epiphagus. What is it? The lady inquired with little interest. Why, what profound ignorance! My dear, a man who learns after marriage that his wife does not know Greek has the right to a divorce. The Epiphagus is a snake that eats other snakes. I hope it will eat all yours. But how does it get the other snakes? By charming them, I suppose? That is just like you, dear, said the doctor. You know how irritating to me are conversations about that common superstition about a snake's power of fascination. The conversation was interrupted by a loud cry, which rang through the silent house like the voice of a demon screaming in a tomb. They sprang to their feet, the man confused, the lady pale and speechless with fear. Almost before the echoes of the last cry had died away, the doctor was out of the room, springing up the stairs 2 steps at a time. He rushed at the door without knocking. Braden lay on the floor, dead. His head and arms were partly concealed under the foot of the bed. They pulled the body away, turning it upon the back. The face was covered with blood and foam, the eyes were wide open, staring. A dreadful sight. "Dead," said the scientist, placing his hand upon his heart. Standing on his knees beside the man, he chanced to look under the bed. "Good God!" he exclaimed, "how did this thing get in here?" He pulled out the snake and threw it, still coiled, to the center of the room, where it stopped by the wall and lay without motion. It was a stuffed snake. Its eyes were two bright buttons,